I'm here with Paul Cox, State Board General Counsel, who will help to answer your questions in a few moments. As you know, tomorrow is the big day, Election Day 2024. It's the last chance for eligible registered voters to exercise their right to vote, do their civic duty, and make their voice heard. We just completed 17 days of in-person early voting with record turnout. Already, nearly 4.5 million voters have successfully cast ballots in this election, or 57% of the registered voters. And as we've said, voter turnout in the 25 western North Carolina counties affected by Hurricane Helene continues to outpace turnout statewide. In those 25 counties, voter turnout is at 59%, 2 percentage points higher than turnout statewide. And even with the tremendous turnout, aside from some long lines in some locations, very few voters had any issue casting their ballot. So despite all of the naysayers, despite all false information and sensationalistic rhetoric out there about elections, and despite a devastating hurricane, we are making this happen in North Carolina. That brings us to Election Day. We expect more than 1 million voters will cast their ballots in North Carolina on Tuesday. More than 2,650 polling places will be open across the state from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Voters in line at 7:30 p.m. will be able to cast their ballot. Voters should go to their assigned polling place. To find your polling place, use the voter search tool on the State Board website, ncsbe.gov. And don't forget to bring your photo ID. This morning, we sent out a press release titled 10 Tips for Election Day Voters in North Carolina. Please share these tips with your audiences so we can have a smooth election day as well. Also, as a reminder, all voters can watch results come in on election night at the State Board's election results dashboard. I want to switch gears for a moment and talk about those voters who have received an absentee ballot but have not yet returned it. Absolutely, positively, do not mail your ballot at this point. It will not make it in time to be counted. You have two options. You can deliver it by hand to your County Board of Elections through 5 p.m. today or by 7:30 p.m. tomorrow, Election Day. Absentee ballots cannot be dropped off at Election Day voting sites. Or you can discard your absentee ballot and vote in person at your Election Day polling place. Finally, this morning, I want to appeal to all North Carolinians. If you're participating in this election as a voter, as a poll worker, observer, or campaigner, please treat others with dignity and respect. We want to remind all North Carolinians that state and federal laws forbid intimidation or interference with voters. It is also a crime to interfere with election officials carrying out their duties. Penalties for violations include prison time, a fine, or both. The State Board takes these incidents very seriously. When they occur, we will work with our law enforcement partners to respond. Voters who are harassed or intimidated should notify an election official immediately. We know the political climate in our country is tense, but North Carolinians proved throughout the early voting period that they can put that aside and participate peacefully in this election process. Let's continue that momentum on Election Day. Let's make North Carolina a model for accessible, safe, secure, and accurate elections. And with that, we will take your questions. We'll start with questions in the room. Make sure to go to the mics if you're going to ask a question from the room, and then we'll go to those online or by phone. And if you're online or by phone, you'll need to press 1 in order to ask your question. Laura?
Laura Leslie with WRAL News. A couple questions real quick. Number one, Western North Carolina. You mentioned the turnout's been high. How many sites do they have in tents, either early voting or precinct sites for Election Day?
We had no early voting sites set up in tents, but we do have 7 tents across 4 are in Yancey County and then 1 each in Buncombe, Burke, and Haywood County. I think the best news is that there is some sort of roadway now, even if it's a temporary roadway, in place to even those tent structures.
And then security. You mentioned, a tense atmosphere. Have you had specific security threats throughout this process or over this weekend? Or also, I guess part 2 is, have you heard of an increased number of interactions over the weekend, or have you heard threats about what might happen on Election Day?
Really, the hostility and so forth has been at a very minimum. In keeping with elections, especially presidential elections, there's been a few verbal, more than anything, altercations between campaigners or individuals who have inappropriately approached voters in the buffer zone or as they approach to vote. But all in all, it's been very calm. We are monitoring because we know from our counterparts in other states that there have been some artificial intelligence videos that have been put out. There's been some attempts for denial of service attacks on other state websites. And so not only are we monitoring for physical security, but we're also monitoring for cybersecurity as well.
Has the state board or county boards taken any extra measures for security for this election?
Since the last presidential election, we have worked with our federal partners to conduct what we call safe assessments. Those are physical security assessments at all the county offices. These then have a tailored approach to what works for their setup. So there are some offices that have installed panic buttons. Others needed to reconfigure their entry space to create a protective barrier between the workers and the public area. So it just depends, but yes, we have taken protective measures. We've also been working closely with law enforcement. Law enforcement cannot be stationed at polling places in North Carolina, but they can be on hand. We've done training with them. They've done training for us to make sure that we know, when they're called in, what are election laws, what are other laws that they have to consider when they're helping to keep the peace or deal with the disruption. Yes.
Good morning, Michael Perchik, ABC 11. A couple of questions with the timing of the votes being counted. Can you walk us through what that process looks like, when the votes can start being counted, when you anticipate those first votes to be uploaded to the Board of Elections website with those unofficial results?
Certainly. So when the polls close at 7:30 p.m., we will be able to release absentee by mail ballot returns. Those will have been tabulated by the County Board of Elections on Election Day and then ready for upload when the polls close. After that, there's been a change in state law to where we cannot release early voting results at that time from the in-person early voting period. So those will be closed, those will be tabulated at the time that polls close, and so we'll begin uploading those as we're uploading Election Day results. I think everyone needs to be mindful that no election results are modemed in. So in those Election Day, over 2,600 polling places, they have to be driven in, those results and those ballots, to the county boards of elections. And so if you think about if there's anyone in line at 7:30 p.m. until those last voters have voted, those workers will not be able to bring in results or close down their polling places. So the bulk of results are going to be uploaded between 9:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. most likely, given the drive time that it takes in many of our counties. And we'll just push them out as quickly as we can. It's going to feel a lot like the state fair traffic when we had a concert going on at the same time. There's going to be some bottlenecks, and everybody just needs to have patience. But know that our objective is we will be provide them as quickly as we can, but the real objective for us is to be as accurate as we can. Most likely, if all goes as planned, we will have the last of the results up sometime in the midnight hour tomorrow night to Wednesday morning.
You just took my next question.
Well,
so
thank
there
you.
you go.
Paul?
And I just wanted to add that the election results that come in on election night, we're estimating about 98% of the votes in the election. There are ballots that our law requires that be counted during the canvass period, so after election day. Any absentee ballots that come in on election day, so Karen was mentioning before about voters who have not yet put it in the mail, they need to bring it into the County Board of Elections office. So if those ballots come in on the election day in the office, they can't be counted that day. They have to be counted at a subsequent meeting during the canvass period. So you're going to have some absentee ballots that get counted after election day. Provisional ballots, we're going to have tens of thousands of provisional ballots across the state that will need to be reviewed and researched by the county boards of elections, and those will be counted during the canvass process as well. So you'll have this 10-day period after election day where a small number relatively of ballots still need to be counted. But as of election night, as Karen said, when the last results come in midnight or hopefully soon thereafter, it'll be roughly 98% of the votes cast.
With CNN, thanks for doing this.
Yes.
So I want to ask more about intimidation. And so the first part of that question is, can you speak to whether there have actually been incidents already of intimidation at polling places that have crossed the line to the point that state or local officials are actually going to take action on those incidents?
Paul, do you want to talk to that? Because some of that might be investigated.
Without getting into specific cases, that whenever we do receive a report of potential harassment, intimidation, or interference with a voter, as the executive director mentioned, we take it very seriously, and we take an incident on that, and our investigators look into it. They'll interview subjects or witnesses and potentially involve local law enforcement. And we have a number of cases that we're looking into right now. It's not widespread. It's sort of on par with what we typically experience in a large election, a general election. So that's the process we use. And if the evidence is substantiated that there was a crime committed, then we'll refer that to a prosecutor.
Just to get into the weeds a little bit for a moment, I'm thinking about tomorrow, and I think on every election day we end up on social media or even in emails to us, seeing people complain that they feel they were intimidated in some way. And so I'm wondering if you can, to the extent you can in a limited amount of time, outline the sorts of behavior that is allowed at polling places. I'm thinking of hearing people say things like, campaign people associated with a campaign were playing music, or they were this close to the polling place, those sorts of things. What is allowed and what does cross the line?
Sure, yeah, that could go over a lot of different things, but we have a pretty detailed memo, and Pat can get that to you, that we released in 2022 that details what is okay and what is not okay in terms of conduct of the polls. But just to briefly describe, voters should be able to enter the voting place, especially once they get to that 50-foot buffer zone, free of any interference. So once you get to that buffer zone, no one should be approaching the voters at all. Even outside of that buffer zone, though, when a voter parks their car in the parking lot and is approaching the voting site, we want to make sure that no one is interfering with their ability to get into the voting site. Now that doesn't mean that a campaigner who wants to advocate for their candidate can't approach the voter and say, hey, will you support my candidate? That's First Amendment activity, that's expressive activity, that's protected. But where it would cross the line is if someone is, instead of just advocating for their candidates, if someone is, questioning the voter aggressively about, are you qualified to vote, and that sort of thing. Trying to assume the mantle of an official that's questioning a voter and whether they can go into the polls. That's the sort of thing that can be intimidating. Another thing that would be against the law would be someone approaching a voter and saying, hey, you can't vote here. Actually, they've moved the voting place somewhere else. Providing false information about the voting process is a crime. So if anyone does that, they would be committing a crime, and if we get that reported, we will investigate it and refer it to prosecutors.
Maggie Newland with CBS 17. With the voter ID law in effect, are you seeing statewide a larger number of people needing to cast provisional ballots due to not having an ID with them, and will that affect potential timing of any results?
We do have an uptick in provisional ballots because of the photo ID law, but not anything unmanageable. And that is actually how the process works. If someone presents themselves to vote and they do not have an acceptable form of ID, then they are offered the opportunity to bring that acceptable form of ID back to the County Board of Elections before the day before canvass, so 9 days after election on the 14th, or they can complete an exception form. And that exception form can list reasons they were unable to obtain an ID, like lack of transportation, work or school conflict. It also can be because of natural disaster. So we've had that used some in Western North Carolina. And then it can be for religious objection for having your photograph taken. So, that is the process. They complete that form and give indication. They complete a provisional ballot, and it goes back to the County Board of Elections, and we will count those during Election Day. There is a report that comes out the day after Election Day indicating the number of provisional ballots. So we'll have a better idea the day after how many need to be considered. And they could still be a provisional ballot because of non-photo ID reasons. Someone appears and they are not on the poll book. We will research why and determine if they're an eligible voter.
And can you talk at all? I know we've talked about record early voting turnout. Have you noticed any patterns that you can compare to previous years, especially when it comes to unaffiliated voters and also young voters?
I don't have the data in front of me. As I recall, the Democrat and Republican Party and unaffiliateds were very high in their turnout. And of course, there are more unaffiliated voters in North Carolina than either of the two political parties. So it's not surprising that they would be sort of neck and neck in terms of turnout. We did in the latter part see an uptick in younger voters turning out. So, it'll be interesting to see who turns out to vote tomorrow, given, where we are. But I think, one of the things I would stress is that this election's not decided. Just because 57% of North Carolinians have already participated, we saw 75% turnout in 2020. So there are still a lot of voters who can come out, vote, and know that your voice will be heard and that your vote will be counted. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for taking our questions. I'm David Lamb with NTD News. So in terms of poll workers and training and hiring, how has this year been in terms of improvements over last year's with poll workers?
We, in terms of, we've had no issues recruiting poll workers. It's been pretty remarkable. It takes about 25,000 individuals to make voting happen at these polling places. And we were even concerned in Western North Carolina that we would see some difficulty. And so part of the resolution and legislation gave flexibility to those counties to allow for people outside the county. And yet they never had to exercise that option. They were able to find workers within their counties. I think whether it's because of Hurricane Helene or just their commitment to this as their civic duty, people want to give back and they want to be involved. And even though they know that the environment has changed and there's more hostility and so forth, I think some people do it in spite of that they know that it takes them to make this happen. They know our processes and how they work. They know that it's a bipartisan effort, and they're committed to that oath that they take. And so we've done well in North Carolina. The political parties do have input on those workers, and so that gives the bipartisan approach. That also gives us a pool of folks to recruit from and work with. And so, all in all, our utmost thanks goes out to those people, those 25,000 North Carolinians who are willing to work these really long days. It's essentially a volunteer job for the pay that they get, but they are exceptional folks for doing this work and serving their neighbors and communities.
And on Election Day, how frequent would the results dashboard be updated? The results dashboard is going to be updated, just ongoing process. As with it being dispersed across 100 counties, we don't have set times that they do their uploads. They do those as they come in, and they're able to, just do a verification check against the tapes. So it will just be ongoing and refreshing continuously. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi, Rusty.
Rusty Jacobs, WUNC. So you addressed poll observers, voters, and the polling sites and any interactions that have already occurred or could occur on Election Day. But what about post-election unrest? Be it candidates questioning outcomes, be there partisan claims of fraud. How much attention have you given that? How can you prepare, or how have you prepared for that?
I've worked in elections for nearly 19 years now, and post-election threats, hostility, harassment were not something that we planned for most of my career. But it certainly has become the case because we've watched our colleagues in Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, other parts, even within our own state, where we were not considered as much of a battleground state in 2020, be subjected to death threats, to harassment and hostility and protests and questions of our own personal integrity. And so, it stands without reason that we have tried to learn from them, understand the relationships that we need to have with law enforcement, make sure that law enforcement is aware of the level of threat that we could face, particularly as a battleground state with so much attention on us. And so I think what we've done is to prepare as best we can and consider it more of an insurance policy that we hope we never have to exercise. But that comes into play. The same protections that we've tried to put in place for any incidents that might happen while voting is taking place will be the things that will be our safeguards through the canvass period and thereafter. And so it is having panic buttons in a lot of our offices. It's having secure entry into areas. We will maintain our transparency. We encourage people to come watch those sample hand-to-eye counts that we do to verify that the tabulators have tabulated correctly. Come to the canvass meeting and learn how we present the results to the board members and prove that these elections have been conducted accurately and fairly and securely, and understand why we are able to certify these elections, because I have no doubt that that's what's going to happen. And then, I would just, make a plea to the candidates and elected officials. Have a peaceful transition of power. Accept the results. Concede defeat when necessary. And please recognize that it is members of this community. It is election professionals. These are people who have sworn oaths, and this is a bipartisan effort to ensure that every eligible voter is able to cast their ballot, and that these results are tabulated and determined securely, accurately, and correctly.
Hi, I'm Helen Koster from Reuters. Thank you for your time. You mentioned that you've seen an uptick in younger voters. Have you seen any patterns with regard to men, women, and Black voters in early voting so far?
As I recall the results, we do have the data. We have this published daily on our state board website. So if you have any issues with that, you can get with our communications director and we can provide that to you. But we have seen women outpacing men in terms of turnout. We saw more Black voters turning out as we went through the 17-day period, so their percentage of turnout was ticking up, and a lot of this data, again, is available on our daily sheets that we've been maintaining through the early voting period.
And a quick follow-up, you talked about some of your post-election planning. Can you talk about any staffing changes that you've implemented since 2020 in terms of the potential reallocation of resources to different issues, given these heightened threats this year?
Actually, we do not even have the amount of personnel that we did in 2020. We did not receive the appropriated positions or the allocation of some of the federal grant funds to have as many field support specialists as we did in 2020. So we have stretched and we have made it work. And I think that is just a testament to the dedication and the passion and commitment that, particularly at the State Board of Elections, that the staff has to ensure that these elections go as smoothly as possible. It has been really an effort to maintain the partnerships that we have in place with cybersecurity experts here in North Carolina, through other agencies, through the federal agencies, and as we have often been asked to do do more with less, and that is what we have done. And I think it's exceptional what we've been able to pull off by the State Board of Elections. And the counties, many of them have faced the same struggles in not having adequate resources and personnel, but they've made it work.
Thank you.
Laura Leslie with one quick follow-up to Rusty's question. And this has to do with legal suits. This might be a question for Paul. I don't know. How many lawsuits have been filed already about this current election against the Board of Elections?
I'll let you deal with that one.
I don't know the exact number, but it's about the conduct of this current election. It's probably around 10. And most of those are in different phases of litigation. Nothing. We have one case that has been briefed about overseas voters that are U.S. citizens that is being briefed right now to the state Supreme Court. That's the only case that I'm aware of that could conceivably have a decision before or on election day. All the other cases are sort of in a holding pattern where the rules are set, the rules of the road are set as they should be before election day. And so, we'll see what the courts decide in the coming weeks, but that's sort of where we are with all the litigation.
How does that compare to an average year? Or election year, I should say.
I would say that the volume this year compares, maybe not quite as heavy as 2020. 2020, we saw a lot more litigation over voting rules just because of the pandemic and a lot of groups being concerned that the regular voting rules were not going to be adequate to make sure that all voters would be able to cast their ballots. So I don't think it's quite as high as it was back in 2020, but as the executive director mentioned, we're a battleground state, so we are experiencing some litigation because of that. Our sister states like Pennsylvania and Georgia have seen more litigation than we have comparatively, but it's still a significant amount.
Looks like we can go to the phones or online for questions. Remember to press 1 to have your question go live.
Hi, first question online is from Allie Reed of AccuWeather Network. Allie, please go ahead.
Hi there. I hope you guys are doing well. Thanks for doing this press conference. Quick question for you guys in regards to, again, Hurricane Helene and the impacts that has had on this election. Can you guys just explain further what you guys had done following the hurricane to make sure and ensure that everyone that was going to vote in this election was able to?
So we've taken a series of steps since Hurricane Helene did such devastation to Western North Carolina. Initially, it was just to make sure that we could get our offices back up and running and able to serve the public. That took about a week as we had 14 that were not online that very first Monday following the devastation. Within that, shortly thereafter, we were working with the Postal Service as well to make sure that mail service was continuing, be that for voter registration mailings or for the absentee ballot requests, since that had already started and we could also receive mail for those purposes. We worked with North Carolina Emergency Management to begin identifying what it would take to be open for early voting on October the 17th, and that included obtaining power to the sites, determining if they would need portable restrooms, things of that nature. We worked with the counties, with other officials, and among the state board staff to help craft a resolution for the state board to adopt that gave flexibility to the 13 hardest hit counties. That resolution became the basis for the legislation that was passed in the Disaster Relief Act that expanded it to 25 disaster area counties, and that was signed into law by the governor. This gave the counties flexibility in terms of relocating or changing the hours necessary for early voting to continue. That also allowed them flexibility with poll workers, with polling places for election day, and things of that nature, and also the ability for multi-partisan assistance teams to assist voters beyond what is designated with care facilities. So That's, those were the other key steps, and then it just became, working the plan until we could ensure that we could have as many sites open as possible. We had early voting sites open in all 100 counties on the day that early voting started. That included 76 of 80 planned sites in those 25 Helene-affected counties. We had power, which is a testament to the power companies and the linemen for making sure that that was possible. We then, so we had voting going on. We turned our attention to Election Day, and as things have continued to improve, we have been able to open up the vast majority of polling places. We have been able to address voters in isolated areas, and through the efforts of emergency management and DOT and so many others, there is a way into those isolated areas now, and we only are using 7 temporary tents that emergency management helped us to source and get set up securely and safely for 4 in Yancey County, and then 1 each in Buncombe, Burke, and Haywood County. And then I think, to know that this has worked well, you look at the turnout and the fact that Western North Carolina is outpacing the rest of the state thus far is just a testament to the dedication and the extraordinary efforts by the election officials, by our partners at the state, local, and federal levels to make sure that even when devastation struck, that did not stop voting. Next question online.
Next question goes to Tom Frank with Politico. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned the 7 tents. How many voting sites in the western and the 25 affected counties have been moved from their previous or planned location?
I'll ask you to let our comms department give you that specific data. We've obviously had to make some different kinds of adjustments. In some cases, it's the same site is being used, but the tent has been placed there. In some situations, it's that we actually did have to relocate, but it may just be a facility that's across the street or just down the road. In some cases, we haven't necessarily completely shut down the facilities. We've just had to make adjustments. So if you want to know some more specific data, let our comms department give you that information. Next question.
Next question is from Chris Crome, Facing South. Chris, go ahead.
Hi, this is Chris Crom. Thank you. A question about mail ballots. The latest data I saw that there were some 200,000 mail-in ballots that had been requested that hadn't been returned yet, so just under half. That'll obviously change today and tomorrow as those ballots come in, and you gave very clear instructions that voters shouldn't mail the ballots at this stage. They need to take them directly to election board offices. And there's definitely been some concerns and talk about mail delays. So just wanted to get your thoughts about that situation, and specifically what advice you would offer to voters who might be worried about whether their ballot will arrive in time by 7:30 tomorrow, and anything that media outlets or others can do to inform voters about their options. Thank you.
So we do have a number of more requests that were made than ballots have been returned, but that's not uncommon. There are a lot of folks who will make sure that they have that ballot in case that's the way that they would like to vote, and they just see how their schedule or the weather or whatever might be their motivation determines whether they go and vote in person either during early voting or on election day. So we do anticipate it's not going to be a one-for-one on requests to return for absentee ballots. Voters can't, if they choose to vote in person, instead of using that absentee by mail ballot that they've already received, they can discard it and go to their election day polling place. If they have not mailed it back in and they do want to vote absentee by mail, mail is not going to get delivered at this point. It's too short of a window, and certainly the guidance by the Postal Service is to allow for a week, and we do not have a week at this point. So they should deliver that to their County Board of Elections office today during business hours or by 7:30 p.m. The law did change in North Carolina, and this is our largest election where it has been in effect, that absentee by mail ballots must be returned to the County Board of Elections in their hands by 7:30 p.m. on election night. So that is 7:30 p.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, November the 5th, in order for it to be counted. There is no longer a grace period or a postmark circumstance in North Carolina any longer. Now, with Hurricane Helene, voters who choose to vote by mail and are registered in one of those 25 affected counties, there is the option for them to take that to a county board of elections outside of their home registration. We are logging those, time stamping and date stamping those, and they are being securely returned to the home or issuing county board of elections. And so they are the only voters who get that exception. All other voters who want to return their absentee by mail ballot must do so in person to their county board of elections either today or tomorrow by 7:30 p.m. Absentee ballots, if the voter is not able to return it, absentee ballots can be returned by a near relative or legal guardian, and we will log that information when those ballots are turned in. Next question.
That was the last question online.
No other questions. Great. Thank you all so much for helping us to get accurate information out to the voters of North Carolina. We look forward to serving folks tomorrow on Election Day. And remember that polls are open from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. And if you need to learn where your voting site is or to look up your registration information or see your sample ballot, that is available on ncsbe.gov through the voter search tool. Thank you.